Maria Santos had been invisible for 3 years. Every morning at 500 hours, she arrived at the mess hall on Forward Operating Base Sentinel, tied her hair back in a regulation bun, and began preparing meals for 800 soldiers. Most days, she served over 2,000 plates of food. Most days, nobody looked her in the eye. She preferred it that way. The other kitchen staff called her Silent Maria because she rarely spoke unless spoken to directly. They assumed she was just another quiet civilian contractor, grateful for steady work and a chance to send money back to her family in El Salvador. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. What they didn't know was that Maria Santos had once been Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Army Military Police Corps. What they didn't know was that she had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside bomb changed everything. The explosion that took her left leg below the knee had also taken her military career, her confidence, and nearly her will to live. But that was 5 years ago. Now she wore a prosthetic that barely slowed her down and a civilian badge that let her blend into the background. The Army disability pension helped, but she needed to work. More importantly, she needed to be useful again, even if it was just ladling mashed potatoes onto plastic trays. Forward Operating Base Sentinel sat in a strategically important valley in eastern Afghanistan, controlling access routes that insurgent groups desperately wanted to use. The base housed elements from the 82nd Airborne Division, Special Forces units, intelligence teams, and a growing number of civilian contractors. It was a busy, dangerous place where mortars fell regularly and patrol schedules changed without warning. Maria knew the base better than most people realized. During her 3 years in the mess hall, she had developed an almost supernatural awareness of routines, personalities, and the subtle changes that meant something was about to happen. She noticed when Special Forces teams returned from missions with fewer men than they'd left with. She observed which officers ate together and which ones sat alone. She memorized faces, voices, and the particular way each unit carried itself after good news or bad. Most importantly, she had learned to read the base commander, Colonel James Morrison. Colonel Morrison was what the younger soldiers called old school Army. At 52, he had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen smaller conflicts that never made the evening news. He was tough, fair, and absolutely devoted to bringing every one of his soldiers home alive. The stress of command had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair steel gray, but it had also honed his instincts to a razor's edge. Every morning, Colonel Morrison entered the mess hall at exactly 0630 hours. He took his coffee black, his eggs over easy, and his bacon crisp. He always sat at the same corner table where he could see both entrances and most of the dining area. He read intelligence reports while he ate, occasionally marking passages with a red pen that he kept in his left breast pocket. Maria had served his breakfast 1,095 times. Not once had he looked directly at her face. That was fine with Maria. She had learned that being invisible had advantages. People talked freely around invisible people. They forgot that servers had ears and eyes and brains capable of connecting dots that others might miss. Over 3 years, Maria had overheard fragments of conversations that painted a picture of a war that was more complex and dangerous than anything reported in the news. She knew about supply routes under constant threat, about intelligence assets in enemy territory, about the delicate balance between military objectives and diplomatic constraints that kept Colonel Morrison awake at night. She also knew that something big was building. For the past 2 weeks, the base had hummed with a different kind of energy. More helicopters came and went. More encrypted communications equipment appeared in the command center. Officers who usually joked with their meals ate in silence, reviewing documents that they kept face down when anyone passed by. Most telling of all, Colonel Morrison had started taking his coffee with cream. It was a small change, but Maria noticed small changes. In her experience, when a man who had drunk black coffee for 3 straight years suddenly needed cream, it meant his stomach was churning with stress. It meant whatever was coming was big enough to disrupt even the most basic routines. On Tuesday morning, as Maria refilled the Colonel's coffee cup, she heard him speaking quietly into his secure phone. "The asset confirms the location," he said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Timeline is compressed. We move tomorrow night." Maria's hand remained steady as she poured, but her mind raced. Asset. Location. Tomorrow night. In military parlance, that usually meant someone was about to risk their life to gather intelligence or complete a mission that couldn't wait for ideal conditions. She had heard enough similar conversations during her active duty years to know that compressed timeline was never good news. It meant that circumstances were forcing an operation before all the pieces were perfectly in place. It meant acceptable risk was being recalculated on the fly. As she walked back to the kitchen, Maria found herself thinking about her old life. Sergeant Santos had been good at her job in the military police. She had possessed an instinct for danger, an ability to spot threats that others missed, and a talent for thinking 3 steps ahead of people who meant harm. That version of herself felt like a different person now. But sometimes, in quiet moments between the morning and lunch rushes, she could feel those old instincts stirring. She could feel herself cataloging details and analyzing patterns without conscious thought. Like the fact that the base's internet and phone connections had been mysteriously unreliable for the past 3 days. Like the way certain Special Forces soldiers had quietly stopped showing up for meals, suggesting they were already positioned somewhere else. Like the arrival of 2 new helicopters with unusual markings that she didn't recognize. Most concerning of all was the change in Colonel Morrison's security detail. Normally, the colonel moved around the base with 1 or 2 soldiers who stayed at a respectful distance. For the past week, he had been accompanied by a full 4-man team that positioned themselves at every entrance and kept their weapons at a higher state of readiness than Maria had ever seen on the base itself. Someone was expecting trouble. Wednesday afternoon brought a sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet and grounded all aircraft. Maria worked through the lunch rush, listening to wind that howled like a living thing and rattled every piece of metal on the base. Sand found its way through every seal and around every barrier, coating surfaces with a fine layer of grit that made everything taste dusty. The storm also brought an unusual visitor. Maria was cleaning tables when she noticed a man in civilian clothes sitting alone near the back wall. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that suggested professional training in being forgettable. He ate slowly, checking his watch every few minutes, and kept glancing toward the kitchen as if waiting for something specific. What caught Maria's attention was his hands. Despite his civilian clothes, he had military hands, calloused from weapons handling, scarred in the specific ways that came from field work. And he wore his watch with the face on the inside of his wrist, the way Special Forces soldiers were taught to prevent reflections from giving away their position. He was also nervous. Maria could see it in the way he ate, taking small bites and chewing longer than necessary, as if food was the last thing on his mind. When she approached to clear his table, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance in a single glance. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'm supposed to meet someone here. Colonel Morrison. Have you seen him today?" Maria paused. In 3 years of working in the mess hall, no one had ever asked her about the colonel's whereabouts. More importantly, Colonel Morrison's schedule was not information that should be shared with unauthorized personnel, regardless of how official they might look. "I serve food," Maria replied carefully. "I don't track people." The man nodded, but she could see him studying her face as if trying to read something in her expression. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. If you do happen to see the colonel, could you tell him that Mr. Peterson is waiting? It's important. Maria took the card without looking at it and slipped it into her apron pocket. I'll let someone know. But as she walked away, she felt Peterson's eyes following her, and something about his presence on the base during a sandstorm, asking for the colonel while wearing civilian clothes and military body language, set off every alarm bell in her head. Back in the kitchen, Maria found herself thinking about the timing. A mysterious civilian asking for Colonel Morrison, a compressed timeline for some kind of operation, increased security around the base commander, internet and phone problems that would make it difficult to verify anyone's identity or credentials. She thought about asset verification protocols from her MP training. How easy it would be for someone with the right knowledge to present themselves as authorized personnel during a communications blackout. How a sandstorm would provide perfect cover for infiltration. How invisible people like kitchen workers might be the only ones in position to notice things that security teams couldn't see. Maria pulled Peterson's business card from her pocket and studied it carefully. It looked official enough. Government printing, proper typography. The kind of card that could be produced by anyone with access to the right equipment and 5 minutes of design software. The name meant nothing to her, but the agency listed on the card sent a chill down her spine. If Peterson really was who he claimed to be, then Colonel Morrison was about to meet with someone from an organization that didn't officially exist and didn't leave paper trails. If he wasn't who he claimed to be, then Colonel Morrison was about to walk into a trap. Maria stood in the kitchen holding the business card and feeling 3 years of careful invisibility cracking around the edges. The smart thing would be to pass the message to base security and let them handle it. The safe thing would be to stay in her lane and keep serving food. But Sergeant Santos had never been particularly good at the smart or safe thing, and something deep in her gut was screaming that Peterson was not what he appeared to be. The question was whether anyone would listen to a warning from someone whose job was ladling gravy. Outside, the sandstorm continued to howl, and somewhere in the reduced visibility, plans were moving forward that would determine whether tomorrow brought success or disaster. Maria Santos stood at the crossroads between her old life and her current one, holding a business card that might be the key to preventing something terrible from happening. She thought about Colonel Morrison, who had spent 3 years eating breakfast at the same table, trusting that the people around him were who they appeared to be. She thought about the 800 soldiers on the base who depended on their commander to make decisions that would keep them alive. And she thought about what Sergeant Santos would do if she were still wearing a uniform and had the authority to act on her instincts. The storm was getting worse, and night was coming. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. Maria folded the business card carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. Then she untied her apron, hung it on its hook, and walked toward the door. It was time to stop being invisible. Maria found Colonel Morrison in his office, door slightly ajar, reviewing mission briefs by the light of a single desk lamp. The sandstorm had knocked out power to half the base, and emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows that made even familiar spaces look dangerous. She knocked twice on the door frame, the sound sharp in the desert wind. "Sir? There's someone in the mess hall asking for you. Says his name is Peterson." Colonel Morrison looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, his eyes focused directly on Maria's face. His expression shifted from distraction to attention in the space of a heartbeat. "Peterson? Are you certain about the name?" "Yes, sir. He gave me a business card." Maria pulled it from her pocket and handed it to him. The colonel studied the card under his desk lamp, turning it over twice before setting it down carefully. When he looked up again, Maria could see something new in his eyes. Not just attention now, but calculation. What did this Peterson look like? Maria had been hoping for that question. 40 years old, approximately. Brown hair, medium build, civilian clothes but military bearing. scarred hands consistent with weapons training, watches his surroundings like someone with combat experience. Colonel Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. That's quite an observation from serving him lunch. I notice things, sir. For a long moment, the colonel studied her face in the lamplight. Then he reached for his secure phone and dialed a number from memory. This is Morrison. I need immediate verification on a Peterson from your organization. Yes, I'll wait. While he waited, Maria stood in the doorway listening to the wind and fighting every instinct that told her to speak up about her concerns. She was a kitchen worker now. Kitchen workers didn't offer tactical assessments to base commanders, but Sergeant Santos would have. Sir, she said quietly, permission to speak freely? Colonel Morrison held up one finger, still waiting for his call to connect. Then, go ahead. The timing feels wrong. Sandstorm grounds all aircraft and cuts communications. Mysterious civilian shows up asking for you by name. If I were planning an infiltration, this is exactly the kind of conditions I'd wait for. The colonel's phone buzzed. He answered it without taking his eyes off Maria. Morrison here. What do you mean, no record? Check again. I see. Thank you. He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. There is no Peterson assigned to this operation. In fact, there's no record of anyone by that name being authorized to contact me at all. Maria felt her stomach tighten. Sir, where is he now? Good question. Colonel Morrison reached for his radio. Base security. This is Morrison. I need the current location of a civilian visitor, male, approximately 40, in the mess hall 15 minutes ago. What? Say again? Maria watched the colonel's face change as he listened to the response. Security has no record of any civilian visitors today, he said, setting down the radio. The main gate logged no arrivals since yesterday morning. The implications hit both of them at the same time. Someone calling himself Peterson had gotten onto a secure military base during a sandstorm without passing through any checkpoint. Someone with military training and false credentials had been asking for the base commander by name. Sir, Maria said, I think you should cancel whatever meeting you had planned. The meeting was supposed to be tomorrow night, off base. If Peterson is here now, either the timeline has changed or... Colonel Morrison stood up and reached for his sidearm. Or someone is trying to disrupt tomorrow night's operation. Through the office window, Maria could see figures moving in the storm-reduced visibility. Too many figures. Moving with too much purpose to be normal base foot traffic. Sir, we need to get you to a secure location. Now. Colonel Morrison looked at her sharply. We? With respect, sir, I know this base better than your security team knows it, and right now, you need someone who can think like the enemy. Outside, the lights in the command center went out. Then the communications building went dark. Then the motor pool. Someone was systematically cutting power to key installations, creating confusion and isolating the command structure. It was a textbook infiltration tactic, designed to separate leadership from their ability to coordinate a response. How many people are we dealing with? Colonel Morrison asked, checking his weapon. Maria closed her eyes and thought back to everything she had observed over the past week. The pattern of missing soldiers, the unusual helicopter arrivals, the communications disruptions. At least 6, she said, probably 8. Military training, equipped for night operations, familiar with base layout. They've been preparing for this for days. The colonel stared at her. You're not a kitchen worker. I am now, sir, but I used to be military police. Sergeant Maria Santos discharged 5 years ago after an IED took my leg. Santos? Recognition dawned in Colonel Morrison's eyes. You're the MP who identified the Kandahar infiltration network, the one who prevented the attack on the general's convoy. That was a long time ago, sir. Not that long. The colonel moved to his wall safe and pulled out a backup radio and additional ammunition. Sergeant Santos, I'm reactivating you to active duty under emergency combat conditions. Do you accept? Maria felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Purpose. Authority. The weight of responsibility that came with being trusted to protect others. I accept, sir. Outstanding. Now get us out of here. Maria moved to the office window and studied the movement patterns outside. The infiltrators were good, but they were following a plan based on assumptions about how the base commander would react to an emergency. They expected him to move toward the command center, or call for his security detail, or try to reach the communications building. They didn't expect him to disappear into the base infrastructure with someone who knew every tunnel, every maintenance access, and every route that didn't appear on any official map. Follow me, sir. Stay low, match my pace exactly, and whatever happens, don't try to be heroic. Maria led Colonel Morrison out the back of his office through a door that opened onto a maintenance corridor. The passage was narrow and dark, used primarily by electricians and plumbers, but it connected to the underground utility tunnels that ran beneath the entire base. As they moved through the darkness, Maria's mind shifted into a tactical framework she hadn't used in years. She cataloged their assets: 2 weapons, limited ammunition, no communications, knowledge of terrain. She assessed their objectives: keep the colonel alive, get him to a secure location, find a way to alert friendly forces. Most importantly, she evaluated their enemies: professional infiltrators with a plan that had gotten them onto the base undetected. They would have studied the base layout, identified key personnel, and planned multiple contingencies. But they were operating during a sandstorm, which limited their visibility just as much as it limited everyone else's. The utility tunnel system was Maria's advantage. She had spent 3 years walking every inch of the base, noticing details that others ignored. She knew which tunnels connected to which buildings, which ones had emergency exits, and which ones would be overlooked by anyone planning an assault from above ground. 20 minutes into their movement through the tunnel system, Maria held up a hand for silence. Through the concrete walls, she could hear voices speaking in a language that wasn't English or Pashto. "Sir," she whispered, "they're not insurgents." "What do you mean?" "I can't identify the language, but the accent patterns sound European. This isn't a Taliban operation. This is something else entirely." Colonel Morrison processed this information in silence. An attack by local insurgents would be one kind of threat. An attack by foreign operatives suggested something much more complex and dangerous. They continued through the tunnels until Maria found what she was looking for: an access point that opened into the base's backup communication facility. It was a small, hardened building that most people forgot existed, designed to maintain contact with higher headquarters if the main communications center was compromised. "Can you reach higher command from here?" Maria asked. "If it's still functional, yes." The backup facility was dark, but undamaged. Colonel Morrison activated the emergency power and began working the radio equipment while Maria positioned herself at the single window to watch for approaching threats. Outside, the sandstorm continued, but she could see muzzle flashes in the distance. Someone was exchanging fire near the command center. The base's security forces were engaging the infiltrators, but without coordination, they were fighting blind. "Falcon Base, this is Sentinel-6. Colonel Morrison spoke into the radio microphone. "We have multiple hostile infiltrators on base. Request immediate air support and backup communications. Roger, understand weather prevents air support. I need you to contact General Harrison directly. Tell him the Uzbek operation is compromised." Uzbek operation. Maria filed that information away. Whatever was supposed to happen tomorrow night involved Uzbekistan, and someone had decided to prevent it by eliminating Colonel Morrison. "Sir, we can't stay here," Maria said. "They'll sweep every building systematically once they realize you're not in your office." "Where do you suggest?" Maria thought about the base layout and the enemy's probable search pattern. They would expect to find Colonel Morrison in a building, or trying to escape the base perimeter, or hiding in an obvious place like a bunker. They wouldn't expect to find him in the most exposed location on the base. "The water tower, sir." Colonel Morrison looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "That's the highest point on the base. We'll be completely exposed." "Exactly. It's so exposed that no one would think to look there. And from the top, we can observe their entire operation and coordinate a response when reinforcements arrive." It was risky. The water tower stood 80 feet above the ground, accessible only by a maintenance ladder that would leave them vulnerable during the climb. But it was also the last place anyone would expect to find the base commander during a hostile infiltration. More importantly, Maria had another reason for choosing the water tower. During her years in the mess hall, she had noticed that the maintenance access panel was secured with a lock that had been broken for months. Base maintenance had been meaning to replace it but kept postponing the work order. The broken lock meant they could get inside the tower structure itself, protected from the weather and hidden from observation, while still maintaining visual contact with the entire base. "Trust me, sir," Maria said. "I have a plan." They left the backup communication facility during a lull in the gunfire and moved across open ground toward the water tower. The sandstorm provided cover, but it also made every step treacherous. Maria's prosthetic leg struggled with the uneven terrain, but she pushed through the discomfort and focused on getting them to safety. Halfway to the tower, they heard vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The infiltrators were expanding their search pattern, using stolen base vehicles to move quickly between buildings. "Down," Maria whispered, and they dropped flat against the ground as headlights swept overhead. The vehicle passed within 20 feet of their position, close enough for Maria to see that the occupants were wearing night vision equipment and carrying automatic weapons. These were not amateur insurgents. These were professionals with military-grade equipment and training. When the vehicle disappeared into the storm, Maria and Colonel Morrison completed their movement to the water tower. The maintenance ladder was slick with sand and moisture, making the climb dangerous, but they reached the access panel without being detected. Inside the tower structure, they found a maintenance platform that provided shelter from the weather and concealment from ground observation. Through the small windows built into the tower walls, they could see the entire base spread out below them. What they saw confirmed Maria's worst fears. The infiltrators weren't trying to kill Colonel Morrison directly. They were systematically destroying the base's ability to function as a military installation. Communications equipment was being targeted with explosive charges. Vehicle motor pools were being sabotaged. Ammunition storage areas were being rigged with incendiary devices. Someone was planning to eliminate forward operating base Sentinel entirely, along with everyone stationed there. "Sir," Maria said, watching another explosion light up the storm, "this isn't an assassination attempt. This is ethnic cleansing. They're going to destroy the entire base and make it look like an insurgent attack." Colonel Morrison understood immediately. "The Uzbek operation. If this base is eliminated tonight, we can't provide support tomorrow night. Whatever our people are trying to accomplish over there, they'll be on their own." Through the radio static, they could hear fragmentary reports from other bases. Coordinated attacks were happening at multiple locations. The operation wasn't limited to forward operating base Sentinel. Someone was trying to cripple American military capability across an entire region. Maria watched the patterns of movement below and began to see the enemy's plan. 8 infiltrators working in 4 teams. Systematic destruction of key installations. Extraction planned before dawn, leaving behind evidence that would point to local insurgent groups. But they had made one mistake. They assumed that eliminating the base commander would prevent any coordinated resistance. They didn't know about the invisible woman who had been watching and learning for 3 years. They didn't know about Sergeant Santos, who had once been very good at stopping people who threatened American soldiers. "Sir," Maria said, checking her weapon, "I have a plan to stop them. but you're not going to like it." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the water tower, a former military police sergeant was about to remind everyone why the Army had once trusted her to protect people who mattered. The rescue was just beginning. Maria's plan was built on 3 years of watching patterns and 15 minutes of tactical analysis. The infiltrators were professional, but they were operating according to a schedule that assumed no organized resistance. They moved with confidence through the base, timing their attacks on infrastructure to create maximum chaos in minimum time. That confidence was about to become their weakness. "Sir, they're using our own communication frequencies," Maria observed, listening to radio chatter through the colonel's backup radio. "They monitored our protocols long enough to know how our security teams coordinate. That's why they've been able to stay one step ahead of base security." Colonel Morrison adjusted the radio frequency and listened. The voices were speaking English with slight accents, using proper military terminology and call signs. To anyone not listening carefully, they sounded like legitimate friendly forces responding to an emergency. "How long before they finish their mission?" he asked. Maria studied the movement patterns below. 2 teams had completed destruction of the communications center and were moving toward the ammunition storage areas. 1 team was systematically destroying vehicles in the motor pool. The 4th team was moving methodically through the barracks areas, probably placing charges that would eliminate the base's personnel capacity. 20 minutes, she said. Maybe 30 if the storm slows them down. After that, they extract, and this entire base becomes a crater in the desert. "And your plan?" Maria pointed to the base's fuel depot, a cluster of storage tanks that supplied all ground vehicles and backup generators. "They haven't hit the fuel yet. They're saving it for last because it'll create the biggest explosion. But that also means it's their final objective before extraction." "I'm listening." "We let them come to us. All 4 teams will converge on the fuel depot to place the final charges. When they're concentrated in one location, we eliminate them." Colonel Morrison looked at her skeptically. 2 people against 8 trained operators?" "Not 2 people, sir. 1 person with intimate knowledge of the terrain, and 1 person with the authority to coordinate what's left of base security." Maria had been thinking about this for 3 years without realizing it. Every day in the mess hall, she had observed which soldiers could be trusted under pressure, which ones had real combat experience, and which ones would follow orders without hesitation when everything went wrong. She had also memorized the location of every maintenance access, every emergency supply cache, and every defensive position that the base's official security plans overlooked. "Sir, the base security teams are good, but they're reacting to an enemy who's controlling the tempo. We need to reverse that. Make the enemy react to us instead." Through the radio, they could hear growing confusion among the base's defenders. Reports of explosions from multiple locations, conflicting information about enemy numbers and positions, security teams being drawn away from defensive positions to investigate threats that turned out to be distractions. Classic tactics for a small force attacking a larger one. Keep the enemy confused, reactive, and separated. Prevent them from coordinating an effective response. "Here's what we're going to do," Maria said. "You're going to contact every security team leader directly and give them specific coordinates to converge on the fuel depot. Tell them to approach from predetermined positions and wait for your signal to engage. And while I'm coordinating that, I'm going to make myself visible to the infiltrators." Colonel Morrison stared at her. "That's suicide." "No, sir, that's bait. These people have been tracking your movements for days. They know your habits, your security protocols, your likely responses to crisis. What they don't know is that you have backup they haven't accounted for." Maria checked her weapon and began moving toward the water tower's ladder. "I'm going to let them see me moving toward the fuel depot. They'll assume I'm either trying to escape the base or warn someone about their presence. Either way, they'll have to intercept me to protect their operation." "Maria, wait!" She paused at the sound of her first name. In 3 years, Colonel Morrison had never called her anything except Miss or Ma'am on the rare occasions when he had acknowledged her existence at all. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You've already done more than enough by getting me to safety and identifying the threat." "Sir, with respect, this is exactly what I have to do. These people killed or captured American soldiers to get onto this base. They're planning to destroy everything we've built here and make it look like we were incompetent. And tomorrow night, other soldiers are going to die when the support they're counting on doesn't arrive." Maria thought about the faces she served breakfast to every morning. Young soldiers who trusted their leaders to make decisions that would bring them home alive. Experienced sergeants who had families waiting for them. Officers who carried the weight of command with the same dedication Colonel Morrison showed every day. "I've been invisible for 3 years," she continued, "but I was a soldier before I was invisible. And soldiers don't abandon their posts when other soldiers need them." Colonel Morrison nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Give me 15 minutes to get into position, then start moving security teams toward the fuel depot. When you hear my weapon fire, that's your signal to attack." Maria climbed down the water tower into the storm. Moving alone through the reduced visibility felt different from moving with Colonel Morrison. More dangerous, but also more natural. This was what she had trained for in her MP days: solo reconnaissance, independent operation in hostile territory. The prosthetic leg that had seemed like such a limitation in civilian life barely registered now. Adrenaline and muscle memory were stronger than physical limitations. Sergeant Santos was back, and she remembered how to hunt people who threatened her soldiers. She moved through the base using routes that avoided the main pathways, maintenance tunnels, equipment storage areas, spaces between buildings that didn't appear on any security map. Places where an invisible woman could observe without being observed. Twice she encountered infiltrators moving between objectives. Both times she remained concealed, cataloging their equipment, their coordination methods, and their communication patterns. They were good, but they were operating in an environment that Maria knew better than they did. By the time she reached the perimeter of the fuel depot, she had identified all 4 teams and confirmed their planned approach routes. They were converging on the fuel storage tanks from different directions, planning to place charges simultaneously and extract before anyone could respond. They hadn't accounted for someone who had been watching them work for the past hour. Maria positioned herself in a maintenance shed that provided clear sight lines to the fuel depot and good cover from return fire. From here, she could observe the entire area and coordinate her actions with Colonel Morrison's security response. Then she waited. Patience had been part of her MP training. The ability to remain motionless for extended periods while observing potential threats. The discipline to wait for exactly the right moment instead of acting too early or too late. The first infiltrator appeared at the edge of the fuel depot at 0347 hours. He moved carefully between the storage tanks, checking for security personnel and identifying the best locations for explosive charges. The second team arrived 3 minutes later from a different direction. They spread out among the tanks, each member taking responsibility for a specific cluster of fuel storage containers. Maria keyed her radio twice, the signal for Colonel Morrison to begin moving security teams into position. At 0352 hours, the third team entered the fuel depot area. Now, 6 infiltrators were working among the tanks, focused on their mission and confident that they had eliminated any organized resistance. The fourth team arrived at 0355 hours. 8 enemy operatives, all in the same location, concentrated on placing explosive charges that would destroy the base's fuel supply. Maria took a deep breath and thought about 3 years of serving breakfast to soldiers who had never looked at her face. She thought about roadside bombs and prosthetic legs and the choice between remaining invisible or stepping back into the light. She thought about Colonel Morrison trusting her with his life and about soldiers in Uzbekistan who were counting on support that would never arrive if this base was destroyed. Then she opened fire. Her first shot took down the team leader who was coordinating the explosive placement. Military training said to eliminate the command structure first, disrupt communication, and force the enemy to react instead of execute their plan. Her second and third shots targeted operatives who were reaching for weapons. Suppressive fire to prevent organized return fire while friendly forces moved into position. The response was immediate and professional. The surviving infiltrators took cover among the fuel tanks and began returning fire toward her position. But they were now trapped in an area with limited cover, surrounded by highly flammable materials, and under attack from an unexpected direction. Maria could hear Colonel Morrison's voice on the radio, directing security teams to specific positions around the fuel depot. Professional, calm, turning tactical confusion into coordinated response. Team Alpha, approach from the north. Team Bravo, secure the eastern access. Charlie Team, cover the southern perimeter. All teams, we have friendly fire from the maintenance building. Coordinate your approach to avoid fratricide. The infiltrators were good enough to recognize that their situation had changed dramatically. Instead of conducting a carefully planned extraction, they were now fighting for survival against superior numbers in an unfavorable position, but they were also professional enough to adapt. Maria watched them consolidate their position around the largest fuel tank, using it both as cover and as leverage. Anyone shooting at them risked igniting thousands of gallons of fuel. It was a smart tactical decision, but Maria had been thinking about this scenario for the past 20 minutes. She adjusted her position to get a clear angle on the maintenance access panel that controlled fuel flow to the tank they were hiding behind. One carefully placed shot severed the main supply line, and pressurized fuel began spraying across the ground around their position. Now the largest fuel tank was empty, but the area around it was saturated with flammable liquid. The infiltrators were trapped in a location where any spark would create an inferno. "Attention enemy personnel," Colonel Morrison's voice echoed across the fuel depot through a megaphone. "You are surrounded by superior forces. Your position is untenable. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The response came in the form of automatic weapons fire directed at the security team's positions. "Maria!" Colonel Morrison's voice came through her radio. "Can you force them out of cover without igniting the fuel?" Maria studied the tactical situation. The infiltrators were pinned down, but still dangerous. Direct assault would result in casualties among base security personnel. But there was another option. "Sir, I can end this, but I need you to pull your teams back 50 yards from the fuel tank." "Understood. All teams, withdraw to phase line Charlie. Maintain perimeter but increase distance from fuel storage area." Maria waited until the security teams were clear, then reached into her equipment bag for an item she had taken from the mess hall, a standard military smoke grenade, the kind used for signaling and concealment. She pulled the pin and threw the grenade toward the fuel-soaked area where the infiltrators were positioned. White smoke began billowing across the ground, mixing with fuel vapors and creating a dense cloud that obscured visibility completely. But smoke grenades also produced heat. Not enough to ignite fuel under normal circumstances, but enough to create the psychological pressure of imminent danger. Faced with the choice between remaining in position surrounded by fuel vapors and smoke that might ignite at any moment, or attempting to escape through superior forces, the infiltrators chose escape. They broke cover and ran toward what they thought was the least defended perimeter position. They ran directly into Team Charlie, which was positioned exactly where Maria had predicted they would try to break out. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, 6 infiltrators were dead and 2 were wounded and captured. Base security had suffered no casualties. Maria emerged from the maintenance shed as the smoke cleared, limping slightly on her prosthetic leg but otherwise unharmed. Around the fuel depot, security teams were securing the area and checking for unexploded charges. Colonel Morrison approached her with an expression that was equal parts relief and amazement. "Sergeant Santos," he said formally, On behalf of the United States Army and everyone stationed at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, thank you. Just doing my job, sir. Your job was serving meals. This was considerably above and beyond. Maria looked around at the base she had called home for 3 years. Damage from the infiltration was extensive, but the fuel depot was intact, key personnel were alive, and tomorrow night's operation could proceed as planned. Sir, I have a request. Name it. I'd like to continue serving meals in the mess hall, but I'd also like to be available for special assignments when you need someone with my particular skill set. Colonel Morrison smiled for the first time since the crisis began. I think that can be arranged. In fact, I think a lot of things are going to change around here. 3 hours later, as dawn broke over Forward Operating Base Sentinel and the sandstorm finally began to subside, Maria Santos stood in the mess hall preparing breakfast for 800 soldiers. But this time, when Colonel Morrison entered at 0630 hours for his coffee and eggs, he looked directly at her and smiled. Good morning, Sergeant Santos. Good morning, Colonel. Coffee's fresh, and the eggs are just the way you like them. As she served his breakfast, Maria realized that she was no longer invisible. But more importantly, she was no longer hiding from who she used to be. The breakfast rush proceeded normally, with one difference. As soldiers filed through the serving line, many of them nodded to Maria or said good morning. Word had spread quickly about the events of the previous night, and the woman behind the serving counter was no longer just another anonymous face. She was Sergeant Maria Santos, and she had saved their base. 2 weeks later, Colonel Morrison approached her during the lunch preparation. Maria, I have a proposal for you. Sir? The Army needs experienced military police sergeants for a new program, training civilian contractors in base security procedures. It would mean active duty status, full rank restoration, and the opportunity to serve overseas again. Maria considered the offer while stirring a pot of soup that would feed 400 people. Active duty meant leaving the mess hall, leaving the quiet routine that had given her purpose for 3 years. But it also meant using skills that could save lives. It meant being visible in ways that mattered. Will I still be able to help in the kitchen during downtime? Colonel Morrison laughed. Maria, I think you'll find that once people know what you're capable of, they'll keep you busy with more important things than kitchen duty. In that case, sir, I accept. 6 months later, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos stood in a briefing room at Fort Bragg, addressing a class of civilian contractors who would be deploying to forward operating bases throughout the Middle East. Your job, she told them, is not just to fulfill your contracts. Your job is to be the eyes and ears that notice things others miss. You are in a unique position to observe patterns, identify threats, and protect the soldiers who depend on the work you do. In the back of the room, Colonel Morrison watched with satisfaction. The invisible woman who had saved his base was now training others to be equally observant, equally dedicated, and equally ready to act when action was required. Maria Santos was no longer serving meals. She was serving her country in ways that only she could provide, and every morning she woke up knowing that she was exactly where she belonged.